The title of my presentation is 8 Common but Dangerous Nutrition Misconceptions. So during this presentation, I'd just like to talk first, before we dive in, a little bit about why this matters, why food matters, why nutrition matters. So if we look here at this quote, this is by Hippocrates, and this is actually part of the Hippocratic oath that doctors have to take before they graduate medical school. And it says, "Let thy food be thy medicine, and let thy medicine be thy food." Essentially, nutrition, food, is at the center of our health. It's at the center of all sorts of disease states that we find ourselves in, whether it is cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's, things that are affecting ourselves and those around us. And so we're going to get into a little bit about the causes of those diseases and also what we can do about them. What I'm not going to do during this presentation is tell you guys what you already know, which is, we should all be eating fruits and vegetables, we shouldn't be eating junk food, our plates should not look like that. So I'm not going to get into that as much, but what I will talk about is a lot of the more mainstream recommendations that may or may not be completely accurate. So the first thing that we're going to start with is fat, especially saturated fat, causing cardiovascular disease. So this is a misconception that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, and I'm just going to start with some research. So you would expect, if saturated fat is the cause of cardiovascular disease, that an increased intake of saturated fat would then also be associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But if you look at this study up here, which was done in 1998, they looked at the saturated fat intake in a bunch of the European countries and their cardiovascular disease risk, and found very little association. If you actually look on there, there's a slightly negative correlation, meaning that the increased amount of saturated fat actually had a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease. This is a quote from a meta-analysis that was done in 2013, published in the Journal of American Clinical Nutrition. And they found that there was no significant evidence that associated saturated fat intake with cardiovascular disease. This came out almost 6 years ago now, but these are still, we're still recommended to avoid saturated fat to avoid cardiovascular disease risk. So, why would saturated fat be associated with even a negative correlation with cardiovascular disease? The first possible reason would be that we need fats, including saturated fat, in order to absorb many of the vitamins that we're taking in when we're eating our fruits and vegetables. So when you're told by your eye doctor to make sure that you're eating lots of carrots or sweet potatoes for the vitamin A, you actually need to be eating fat with those vegetables in order to be absorbing vitamin A, which is a fat-soluble vitamin. In addition, fat is an extremely efficient fuel source. So efficient, in fact, that our body stores any excess energy that we take in as saturated fat, body fat. So with that, when we're consuming fat, we're consuming an extremely highly dense energy source. Saturated fat specifically is also incorporated as 50% of the total cell membrane amount in our bodies. When the dietary guidelines started suggesting that we not eat saturated fat, we ended up taking out a lot of very healthy foods from our diet, such as butter and coconut oil. Coconut oil, which is a little bit more mainstream now, has been shown to have tons of antifungal and antimicrobial properties, which are extremely anti-inflammatory in the body. And also, if we look at butter out there's a lot of vitamins and minerals in there, including conjugate linoleic acid, which actually has anti-cancer properties. Yet we're avoiding these because they're supposedly causing cardiovascular disease. Our next misconception is that cholesterol is bad and also leads to cardiovascular disease. Now, this is when we're recommended not to eat cholesterol. That doesn't necessarily mean that that is associated with the cholesterol in our blood, but that's where the recommendation comes from. So if we actually look at the amount of cholesterol in our blood, take a look at this chart here. This was a study that was done that looked at the all-cause mortality, so the chances of dying from any disease, including cardiovascular disease, cancer, infection, and the total cholesterol levels in the blood. They looked at data from 164 different countries and found that the cholesterol levels with the lowest risk of all-cause mortality were between 200 and 240 milligrams per deciliter. If you're even approaching 200 milligrams per deciliter in America, most doctors would prescribe you a cholesterol-lowering drug, even though a level between 200 and 240 is actually associated with a lower risk of dying. So that's about cholesterol inside our blood. But, how does that really relate to the cholesterol we're eating? Cholesterol is actually an extremely vital nutrient to our bodies, and so vital that our liver will produce any amount of cholesterol that we aren't getting from our diet. So when we decrease the amount of cholesterol that we're ingesting, our liver actually increases the production of cholesterol to meet our body's need for cholesterol. A few things that we need this cholesterol for would be for every single hormone in our body. So this includes testosterone, estrogen, stress hormones like cortisol, also aldosterone. All of these hormones come from the backbone of cholesterol. Cholesterol is also needed in our cell membranes to allow them to maintain fluidity. And in addition to being needed for all of our cell membranes, our brain is one of the highest consumers in our body of cholesterol. So our brain only makes up 2 to 3% of our total body weight, but actually ends up using almost 25% of the total cholesterol in our blood, in our bodies. There was actually a study that was done in the Journal of American Geriatric Psychiatry that found that the elderly that had the highest cholesterol levels actually had the best memory. In addition to removing our saturated fats from our diet, when we removed foods that were high in cholesterol from our diet, we ended up removing a lot of nutrient-dense foods as well. So this includes things like egg yolks, and we're all told to eat the egg whites. Most of the nutrients found in the egg are actually sourced in the egg yolks. In addition, we've also removed things like grass-fed beef or grass-fed organ meat, which if you look here are even a little bit more nutrient-dense than vegetables. Our next misconception is that sugars, and all carbs in general, are actually contributing to our obesity. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys are jumping up and down saying, okay, we get to eat soda and sugar now and candy. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be telling you guys that. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when we're ingesting sugar. Where does that sugar go in our body and what is it used for? When we're ingesting any form of carbohydrate, the first use would be for immediate energy. So it's converted to glucose and then we then burn that as energy. However, if we don't need energy at the present moment, we store that glucose as what's called glycogen. That can be stored both in our livers and in our muscles. So, in the general sedentary population, many people are overeating carbohydrates compared to the amount that they're actually depleting in their bodies, leaving nowhere to go with full glycogen stores that glucose is then stored as body fat. However, and I see most of you guys looking like this in the gym, that would indicate that we are actually depleting our glycogen stores both in our liver and in our muscles, which means that we do need some amount of carbohydrates in order to adequately recover from our workouts. Now that doesn't mean that we're going to be eating the candy and sodas, but what it does mean is that we can increase, when we're working out, we can increase our fruit consumption, our consumption of organic honeys and maple syrup. We can increase our consumption of different tubers, such as sweet potatoes or potatoes. Our next misconception is that salt is bad, both for our heart health and our blood pressure. Does anybody know what the dietary guidelines suggest we limit our salt intake to? Anybody?
1,500 milligrams a day.
1,500 milligrams is for the average population. So that's for anybody who's above 50 years old, who has hypertension, diabetes. And then for the general population, it's actually a higher limit of 2,300 milligrams per day. So you would assume that in those who have the highest risk of cardiovascular disease, those who are diabetic or have already had cardiovascular events, that a higher amount of sodium would increase the amount of cardiovascular disease risk. However, when you look at the study that was done in the Journal of American Nutrition, they actually found that the sodium intake level associated with the lowest risk of cardiovascular disease was around 4,500 milligrams per day. So that's 3 times as many as they recommend that we take in every day. And that's just in the population that is most at risk. But what about, the general population who is not necessarily at risk for cardiovascular disease? In this other study that was done in the Journal of American Clinical Nutrition, they found that the highest intake of sodium levels was also associated with the lowest risk of cardiovascular events and the lowest risk of death by cardiovascular disease. So why would this be? Why would sodium possibly be protective against cardiovascular disease? What is it doing in our body that's helping us? So to begin with, we need sodium in order to adequately hydrate our cells. when we're drinking all this water, if we don't have enough sodium in our cells, we can't adequately absorb the water that we're taking in. In addition, we need sodium in order to clear the cortisol and other stress hormones from our blood, which, as we all know, chronic stress is a huge player as far as causation goes in cardiovascular disease risk. Now, one other thing that happens when we decrease our sodium levels is because sodium is such a vital nutrient to us, it increases our cravings for sodium, which is what makes it so hard to put down the bag of potato chips or the bag of popcorn, rather than eating naturally salty foods. So, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should be pouring table salt all over our steak and vegetables. But and the reasons for that are because table salt is mostly is very highly refined, meaning that it is virtually devoid of any minerals, other than the small amount of iodine that they add into the table salt after. And they also use a variety of anti-caking agents to allow it to remain the texture that it is. However, if we're using natural, colorful salts, these salts both give us enough sodium and also are colored based on the different minerals that are available inside of the salts.
Like sea salts.
Yeah, different colored sea salts. And so colors include gray. Gray still means that there are still minerals inside of the salt. Alright, so our next misconception is that grains should be the center of our diet. Now, as we know, in America, grains make up the bottom part of the food pyramid, meaning the highest portion of consumption. And they are. The number one source of calories is actually refined flour. Now, if we separate refined flour from whole grains, refined flour is highly processed, often from genetically modified crops, etc. But what about whole grains? What if we're consuming whole grains as the majority of our diet? Well, I would argue that anything that is the majority of our diet should be relatively nutrient dense. If we look here, compared to romaine lettuce, spinach, broccoli, these grains have very few, if any, vitamins. You guys get that? Was that clear on? Alright. On top of that, when we're eating grains, we're actually eating the seeds of the plants. And the plants, they can't get up and fight us to protect their seeds. What they can do is develop anti-nutrients within the seeds that are there to deter animals from eating them. So there are a couple of major anti-nutrients that are found in most grains. The first of which is called phytate, or phytic acid. So this phytate actually binds up with the few amounts of minerals that are in the grains, which keep them from being absorbed and also inhibit general absorption of the grains. On top of that, there's another anti-nutrient called lectins. So lectins have been shown to increase intestinal permeability. Now what that means is that our gut is lined with a line of cells that is one cell thick. And between these cells, there are what are called tight junctions, which allow digested food particles, very, very small particles, to get through the lining and be absorbed by our bodies. However, when lectins are introduced, these tight junctions are separated, which increases the intestinal permeability and is also known as leaky gut. This allows larger food particles to get through the body and then cause an inflammatory state. And this is backed by research primarily by Dr. Feldman. So, if we are going to incorporate some amount of grains as a smaller portion of our diet, there are certain ways that we can prepare them to reduce the amount of anti-nutrients that are in there. The most common methods would be what's called soaking and sprouting, which allows you to actually sprout these seeds and then destroys many of the anti-nutrients that are found within. Our next misconception is that vegetable oils are healthy. And so this misconception began when saturated fat was demonized, and we had to use some sort of fat to cook with as a substitute. If we first just look at the process by which we obtain vegetable oils, it's a rather intensive and industrialized process. They have to use industrial solvents and then bleaching and deodorizing in order to make these oils actually palatable. Now, if we're talking about oils that are relatively unprocessed, yet still come from vegetables, they are made up in a more significant portion of polyunsaturated fats. These polyunsaturated fats are what make the oils liquid, are also less stable than the saturated fats. Now what this means is is that they are more prone to oxidation, both by heat and by air. So oxidation, most people would think of when you leave an apple, cut open, exposed to the air, it browns. So that's oxidation that you can see, yet that same oxidation occurs with these vegetable oils when they're exposed to heat or air for any extended period of time. Now oxidation leads to an inflammatory process in the body, which is at the core of many of the chronic illnesses that we're seeing today, such as diabetes, cancer, and heart disease. In addition to the instability of these polyunsaturated fats, many of the vegetable oils are extremely high in omega-6s compared to omega-3s. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with omega-6s. However, the body naturally functions at the highest level when there's an equal ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. Yet in America, the average amount of omega-6 to omega-3 is between 10 and 20 to 1. This means that we're getting 10 and 20 times as much omega-6 as omega-3s, which also induces an inflammatory state in the body. So, what are we left with to eat, to cook with? What are we going to do? And what about olive oil? Everyone always talks about how healthy olive oil is, especially for your heart. And so basically, if you are using high-quality olive oil product, which is generally hard to find because many of the olive oils on our shelves today actually, they mix in other oils such as corn oil because it's cheaper rather than having a pure olive oil. But if you can find a good brand of olive oil, there are actually enough polyphenols in there, which are very strong antioxidants, to counteract the oxidation that occurs from heat or just from air exposure. On top of that, we could use either butter, coconut oil, or other healthy animal fats in order to either cook with or put on our food. The next misconception is about food sensitivities, and the misconception would be that food sensitivities only affect an extremely small portion of the population. I'm going to start with everybody's favorite, which of course is gluten. And I'm going to start by talking about the differences between celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. So celiac disease is an autoimmune reaction to gluten, meaning that when gluten is ingested in the body attacks the gluten and also sees some part of your own biology as that same foreign molecule and begins attacking itself, leading to autoimmunity. Now, celiac disease is relatively underdiagnosed in the world. There's actually, for every one case of celiac disease that is diagnosed, there are around 6.5 that go undiagnosed. Many of the reasons for this could be that the symptoms manifest in places other than the digestive system. They can manifest through neurological disorders, whether it be depression or ADHD, as well as skin disorders. Now, as far as gluten sensitivity goes, this is generally a more delayed reaction that is relatively less severe as far as the symptoms are. However, researchers actually conservatively estimate that about 1 in every 10 people will either develop or already has some form of gluten sensitivity. Now, even in those who don't have gluten sensitivity, gluten is actually shown to increase intestinal permeability in the gut because gluten is actually a lectin. So Dr. Fasano researched this and found that in everybody in the population, regardless of gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, gluten still increases your intestinal permeability, which can still lead to an inflammatory state. So how do we know if we're sensitive to gluten or any other common foods? The most trustworthy way to find this out would be through what is called an elimination diet, which means that we eliminate the 6 common food sensitivity groups and any others that you may be sensitive to. So these include dairy, gluten, corn, eggs, soy, nuts. And then we remove these foods for a period of time, generally about a month, and then reintroduce the foods individually to determine if you have any symptoms from any of the foods. And many people find that they never had symptoms previously, yet once removing and reintroducing the foods, they found out that they were relatively highly sensitive and had severe symptoms. So the last misconception is that eating less and exercising more is the key to fat loss. So this is what we've been told for quite a while now, And if we look around, obviously the obesity epidemic has not been cured. So there's some disconnect between the recommendation and the results. Part of the reason for this is that hunger doesn't work. When you're eating less and exercising more, you're inevitably going to be more hungry. We'll talk about that pathway in a little bit. But when you're more hungry and you're walking by, a donut at work, a coffee house, whatever it is, you're definitely going to be more likely to be consuming those foods and break down your diet. Now, we don't normally walk around and see animals that look like this. There's a reason for that, and that's because animals, including humans, have regulatory hormones to keep us from becoming obese, from having very high levels of body fat. This pathway would be the leptin pathway. So leptin is a hormone that is produced both short-term and long-term based on energy consumption. So when you're consuming a higher amount of food, leptin is increased and tells your hypothalamus in your brain that you should decrease your appetite and increase your metabolism in order to offset that energy consumption. In the long term, if you have increased body fat levels, then leptin is also produced chronically in a higher state, which then leads to a chronic decrease in appetite and increase in metabolism, which will lead to a balance in body fat. Now, when we're being told to eat less and exercise more, we are decreasing the amount of leptin that's being produced, which is causing an increase in appetite and a decrease in metabolism. So if this leptin pathway was working correctly, then our body fat levels would remain relatively stable. We would never have excess body fat or too little. We would remain at an optimal level. However, there are a few things that cause dysregulation in this pathway. The first of which is chronic inflammation. So this is what we've really been talking about in these first 7 misconceptions, all these things that are causing chronic inflammation states in our body. This would be, the disbalance between omega-6s and omega-3s. This would be the oxidation of the polyunsaturated fats and the vegetable oils. This would also include a lack of nutrient density, so not obtaining all the essential nutrients to our bodies, whether it's vitamins and minerals, or cholesterol, or saturated fats that our bodies need, or sodium. Now on top of that, there are what I like to call engineered hyperpalatable foods. So these foods, whether it's pastries or sodas, other sorts of processed foods, are literally engineered. They are scientists researching ways to create foods that are supposed to override your hunger signals. So when your leptin is when your leptin is high and your hunger is supposed to decrease, your appetite is supposed to decrease to make up for that, these foods override that signal to keep you eating more and more and cause an elevated level of body fat. So what this means is that if we remove these sorts of processed hyperpalatable foods, stick to a relatively whole food diet, then we won't have as much dysregulation in this pathway. So after all this information that I've thrown at you, let's go over just a few takeaways as far as what we can do now based on the research. The first thing we can do is eat foods that contain healthy saturated fats and healthy cholesterol that are very nutrient dense to our diet. We can eat healthy carbohydrates and sugars in line with our activity levels, meaning that if we're very active, eating more, if we're not as active, eating fewer. We can make sure that we're getting an adequate amount of sodium intake through colorful natural salts. We can limit our grain consumption and try to prepare those grains in a more optimal way to remove anti-nutrients. And in place of the grains that we're removing, we can add more nutrient-dense foods, whether it's vegetables or meats or healthy carbohydrates. We can stay away from vegetable oils, especially if you're cooking, meaning using either healthy saturated fat or olive oil, high-quality olive oil to cook with. We can, if we're feeling especially courageous, find time to do an elimination diet. Remove those foods for a period of time and reintroduce them to find out what foods we're actually sensitive to. And finally, we can focus on what we're eating as opposed to how much. Meaning that if we're staying away from the processed foods, staying away from foods that lead us to an inflammatory state, and focus on how much we're eating, our bodies can help to self-regulate our metabolism that will allow us to maintain optimal body fat levels. Alright, so that's everything I have for you guys today.